What if the thing everyone calls paranoia is sometimes just perception with no proof yet? Picture a long hallway in a federal building lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. Somewhere behind a locked door sits a box. Inside are pages that smell like dust and ink, stamped with dates, initials, and the quiet confidence of bureaucracy. To the people named in those pages, the box isn't paperwork. It's a second life, a shadow biography written by strangers. For most of us, suspicion is an emotion we learn to manage. We tell ourselves not to spiral. We breathe. We assume the world is indifferent because indifference is comforting. But there are moments in history when indifference was a costume and attention was the real truth. Men and women who were organizing, writing, marching, donating, singing, or simply refusing to be silent, looked up and felt, without evidence, that something was tracking them. A click on the phone line, a car that seems to reappear too often, a friend who suddenly asks the wrong questions, a rumor that spreads with surgical timing, a job that evaporates, an invitation rescinded, a story planted, a small pressure at the edge of daily life, repeating until it begins to feel like destiny. When people describe that feeling out loud, we often reach for a diagnosis. We call it delusion, stress, ego, fame. We say it gently because we want to protect them from humiliation. We say it firmly because we want to protect ourselves from fear. If it can't happen to them, it can't happen to us. And then sometimes a file arrives, not a dramatic reveal, not a confession on camera, just an envelope, a stack of photocopies, pages with black bars like wounds. The language is dry, almost bored. But that dryness is the point. The text doesn't need to persuade. It records. It inventories. It notes that a room was entered, a conversation overheard, a friendship leveraged, a reputation neutralized. It speaks in verbs that never apologize. This is a story about those moments when a person's private dread becomes public record, when an intuition becomes evidence, when a life is split into two timelines, before the proof and after the proof. The irony is cruel. Proof often arrives late, sometimes decades late, sometimes after the person has been buried, after their loved ones have been told to stop asking questions, after the world has sorted them into the simple categories history prefers: hero, crank, martyr, addict, radical, celebrity, traitor. In the chapters ahead, we'll follow a series of Americans who felt the government's attention move toward them like weather. Some were leaders whose voices carried across crowds. Some were artists whose words made people think. Some were organizers building coalitions, feeding children, demanding fair wages, challenging segregation. Some were ordinary citizens with extraordinary courage. Each of them, in their own way, tried to explain what was happening while it was happening. They were not always believed, because belief requires more than empathy. It requires imagination. It requires accepting that power doesn't only live in laws and speeches, but in quieter places, in surveillance, in dossiers, in disinformation, in the manipulation of memory itself. This is not a story meant to leave you angry for the sake of anger. It's meant to leave you awake, to ask how we decide what is real when the evidence is sealed, classified, delayed, to ask what happens to a human mind when it senses it's being watched but cannot prove it, to ask what we owe one another when someone says, "Something is happening to me," and we don't know whether to comfort them or to listen harder. Because there's a moral difference between paranoia and warning, and sometimes the only thing separating them is time. We'll begin where these stories often begin, with a phone call that doesn't feel private anymore, with a rumor that lands like a stone, with a person standing in the middle of their own life, trying to decide whether to trust their instincts or to doubt themselves. And hanging over everything is the question that makes this journey unavoidable. If memory can be manipulated, what becomes of truth? It began, as so many modern betrayals do, with a sound no one could hear, a faint, imaginary click at the edge of a phone call, a hesitation in a line that should have been smooth, the sense that privacy, once assumed like air, had become something you needed to earn. In the early 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. carried that feeling with him from city to city, hotels, church basements, union halls, living rooms where coffee cooled while plans formed. He would finish a meeting, step into a corridor, and glance back as if the walls might remember what he'd said. To those closest to him, his suspicion sounded like fatigue dressed up as fear. The movement was consuming. Death threats arrived with the morning mail. Marchers demanded a calm face in front of crowds and a steady voice on nights when his hands trembled. If he said he was being watched, wasn't that just the mind trying to make sense of constant danger? But the danger he described wasn't only a stranger with a gun. It was something colder, administrative, methodical, a presence that didn't shout. It documented. Years later, when declassified pages began surfacing, the story of that presence came into focus. The watchfulness was real, and it was not accidental. By 1963, a campaign against King had gathered momentum inside the federal government, fed by an obsession at the highest levels. He wasn't treated merely as a public figure to monitor. He was framed as a problem to be solved. Surveillance was the gateway. Rooms where King slept became rooms where microphones listened. Telephones, at home, at work, around him, became instruments that translated ordinary speech into evidence. Investigators tracked his travel, mapped his relationships, followed the ripples of his influence outward. Friends, staff, donors, acquaintances. The goal wasn't simply to know what he would do, it was to know who he was in the most intimate sense, and to use that knowledge as leverage. And then the line was crossed in a way that still feels like a violation of the national conscience. Recordings were gathered, moments meant to be private, human, imperfect, the kind of moments that never belong in a government archive. Those materials were not kept in silence. They were weaponized. At one point, a package arrived, aimed not at King's politics, but at the fragile architecture of his personal life. It went to his wife. Alongside the material was a letter that tried to mimic morality while practicing cruelty. It suggested that there was only one honorable path left. It set a countdown, as if a human being's existence could be managed like a deadline. The message was not subtle. It was psychological warfare delivered through the mail. And that, perhaps, is what makes this chapter so difficult to sit with. It wasn't a single renegade acting on impulse. It was a system behaving as designed. Paper trails show discussion, approval, logistics, ordinary office procedures wrapped around an extraordinary act of intimidation. Imagine King, alone for a moment, holding the weight of that knowledge. Not the general fear of being hated, but the specific awareness of being studied, catalogued, undermined. To be told, in effect, that your country can press its thumb against your mind until it bruises. People often speak of courage as the willingness to face a visible threat. But there is another kind of courage, living under invisible pressure and refusing to let it rewrite you. King continued. He walked into crowds. He spoke into microphones. He wrote with a hand that had every reason to shake. And yet an unsettling question lingers in the margins of these files, in the quiet between their lines. How many lives have been bent, not by what was done to the body, but by what was done to the mind? If the state can turn a person's private moments into ammunition, where does dignity go to hide? If King's story feels like the slow tightening of a noose, the next one feels like a room suddenly losing oxygen. Malcolm X lived with the kind of visibility that makes anonymity impossible. Wherever he went, people watched. Supporters hungry for clarity, opponents hungry for weakness. But there was another audience, quieter and more consistent, that followed him without applause. It listened, recorded, and filed. He understood this early. Surveillance didn't surprise him. What surprised him, over time, was how fully it infiltrated the spaces where trust should have been safe. In the 1960s, law enforcement agencies didn't merely watch outspoken black leaders from afar. They stepped into their circles. Informants were recruited, embedded, paid. Sometimes they were obvious. Sometimes they were friends. Sometimes they were people who seemed to arrive at the exact moment a movement needed help, offering resources, offering contacts, offering encouragement that subtly nudged decisions in a direction that served someone else. To Malcolm, the world already made one thing clear: power protects itself. When he left the Nation of Islam and began building something new, an international vision of black dignity and human rights, the stakes changed. His message wasn't only for America anymore. It was a bridge to the world, and bridges threaten those who prefer walls. The public remembers the speeches, the urgency, the precision, the refusal to soften reality for comfort. What's harder to remember is how lonely it is to speak that way while feeling hands in the darkness reaching toward you. He was aware of friction around him, tensions that seemed to ignite too easily, arguments that felt staged, personal disputes that swelled into fractures. The kind of division that doesn't look like an attack from outside. It looks like a movement failing from within. Years later, files and disclosures helped confirm what many had suspected. Multiple agencies were closely tracking him, and informants were positioned inside organizations near him. The watching was not passive. It was intertwined with strategy, collecting intelligence, influencing dynamics, and in some cases, amplifying fault lines. When Malcolm was assassinated in February 1965, the shock was immediate and absolute. A man who had become one of the most iconic voices of his time was cut down in a public space, in front of witnesses, in front of family, in front of the very people who believed in him. The aftermath, however, was not simply grief. It was confusion, and then suspicion, and then decades of unanswered questions. Because in the years that followed, the story of what happened and what could have been prevented grew more complicated. Some evidence and testimonies raised concerns about the role of law enforcement, about foreknowledge, about the depth of infiltration in the organizations surrounding him. The question was not only who pulled the trigger, but how many others were watching the scene form in advance. There is a particular kind of pain in realizing that someone may have been monitored intensely and still left unprotected, or worse, monitored in a way that made the danger easier to engineer. Surveillance, in that frame, becomes something more than information gathering. It becomes a form of control over fate. And yet, to speak responsibly, we must hold two truths at once: that Malcolm had real enemies who wanted him dead, and that the state's history of infiltration and disruption around similar figures makes doubt inevitable. Files do not always offer clean answers. Sometimes they offer proof of watching without proof of intervention. Sometimes they reveal interference without revealing the final intent. But for the people who loved him, And for the movements that tried to continue without him, uncertainty itself became a wound. If you cannot know whether the danger came only from the obvious forces you can name or from hidden influences you cannot see, you begin to distrust not only the world, but your own perception of it. That is one of the quiet costs of covert power. It doesn't just remove leaders. It corrodes the shared reality movements need in order to survive. Malcolm X once spoke about the price of freedom, about the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But listening now, with history's documents partially unsealed, another question rises like smoke. What is the price of truth when the people who archive it control when you're allowed to see it? In a small office crowded with paper, Huey Newton once described power as something that reacts like a living creature. Touch it, and it flinches. Challenge it, and it bares teeth. The Black Panther Party began with a simple, radical idea that black communities had the right to protect themselves and to meet their own needs when the state refused. In practice, that idea looked like law books carried on patrols, like free breakfasts for children, like health clinics, like newspapers printed late into the night. It looked like young men and women learning to speak the language of policy and the language of survival in the same breath. To supporters, it was empowerment. To authorities, it was a threat with a uniform. The government's response did not arrive as a single dramatic gesture. It arrived as a campaign, a pressure system, a weather pattern that followed the Panthers wherever they tried to build. There were raids, sudden, violent, theatrical. There were arrests on charges that crumbled later, but still did their work in the moment. Time lost, money drained, headlines shaped. There were court battles that functioned like exhaustion. Even when you won, you paid. And then there was the quieter machinery, infiltration, disruption, rumor. Imagine trying to build a community program when you can't tell whether the volunteer offering help is genuine or assigned. Imagine writing strategy notes while knowing someone might copy them, not to learn, but to sabotage. Imagine sitting in a meeting and realizing that the argument you're having feels strangely engineered, like someone slipped a match into the room and is waiting for the flame. This kind of pressure doesn't just target leaders, it targets relationships. It encourages suspicion until suspicion becomes habit. It turns every disagreement into a potential betrayal. It makes people disappear from your side one by one, not necessarily because they've been persuaded, but because they're terrified. In some cases, the record later showed that official efforts aimed explicitly at disrupting and neutralizing the Panthers. Those are cold words for a warm reality. Families, friendships, and futures. The human story inside those policies is difficult to hold, because the Panthers were not saints. They were young, brilliant, angry, idealistic, sometimes reckless. Like many movements fueled by urgency and grief. They made mistakes. They fractured internally. They struggled with ego, ideology, and the weight of constant confrontation. But the presence of mistakes does not erase the presence of a deliberate campaign against them. If anything, it made the campaign easier. When a movement is already under stress, the smallest push can feel like a shove. One of the most haunting outcomes of this era was the way violence seeped into spaces where community work had tried to grow. People were killed in raids. Leaders were arrested and exiled. Members turned on one another. Sometimes the line between internal conflict and external manipulation blurred until it was almost impossible to separate them. And that blurring might have been part of the design. Because a movement weakened by mistrust will often do to itself what its opponents could never accomplish directly. It will spend its energy fighting its own reflection. It will forget its original purpose in the fog of survival. Years later, when pieces of the government's strategy became visible through released documents and testimony, it offered a grim kind of validation. The feeling of being hunted had not been an overreaction, it had been a description. But validation is not the same as healing. What do you do with the knowledge that your closest circles may have been shaped by invisible hands, that your arguments might have been encouraged, your alliances poisoned, your loyalties tested not by chance but by design? There is a temptation to respond with cynicism, to conclude that everything is manipulation, that trust is naive, that history is just power wearing different masks. But cynicism is another kind of prison. It keeps us from the very thing these movements tried to defend: human dignity, shared purpose, the belief that people can build something better together. So the question that ends this chapter isn't only about the past, it's about the present and about us. If fear can be planted like a seed, how do we protect the fragile courage it takes to trust one another anyway? J. Edgar Hoover understood something that still shapes the modern world. You don't always have to silence a message. Sometimes you just have to make the messenger unbelievable. By the late 1960s, America had become a country arguing with itself in the streets. The Vietnam War dragged on. College campuses erupted. Draft boards burned. Mothers watched sons leave and return as strangers, if they returned at all. People were learning in real time that the state could ask for sacrifice without offering clarity. In that atmosphere, dissent wasn't a side note. It was a national language. And wherever dissent became loud enough to matter, the machinery of attention followed. Surveillance in this era wasn't only about gathering information. It was about shaping narratives. It was about making movements look dangerous, fragmented, immoral, unstable. The point was not simply to know what protesters believed. The point was to turn the public against them, or to turn them against themselves. Imagine a young organizer with a file already started in someone else's cabinet. Their first march, their first leaflet, their first arrest for sitting where they were told not to sit. Each act recorded, categorized, and interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Their life becomes a story told by someone who assumes the worst. Now imagine that file influencing decisions that the organizer never sees. A scholarship committee quietly advised, an employer nudged, a landlord warned, a reporter given a hint, a rumor seeded among friends. Power doesn't need to win every argument if it can win the conditions under which arguments occur. In this climate, the boundary between legitimate security concerns and political targeting became dangerously porous. Anti-war activists, civil rights groups, labor organizers, and student movements all found themselves treated as potential threats. The assumption was broad, that agitation was evidence of subversion, that protest signaled disloyalty, that people calling for change must be manipulated by foreign forces or personal pathology. This assumption offered a convenient moral shortcut. If dissent is infiltrated, you don't have to engage with its ideas. You can dismiss it as contamination. Some of the tactics documented from this era were startling in their creativity and cruelty. Forged letters to create suspicion between allies, anonymous tips designed to trigger conflict, efforts to amplify the most extreme voices within a movement, so the whole movement could be painted with that brush. It was like throwing sand into an engine and then pointing to the sputtering as proof that the machine was flawed. For those living through it, the experience was disorienting. People began to question their own memories. Did she really say that? Did he really do that? Was that letter authentic? Was that phone call real? The very texture of daily reality became unreliable. And this is where the story becomes less about politics and more about psychology. Because what happens when a community loses trust in its own perception? When every rumor could be a planted lie, every disagreement could be engineered, every newcomer could be an informant. Movements require shared reality. They need a common foundation of truth, not perfect, not pure, but stable enough to build on. Disruption strategies attacked that foundation directly. They didn't just oppose protests, they threatened the mental infrastructure that makes collective action possible. It's tempting, looking back, to treat these years like distant history, black and white footage, archival audio, names etched into textbooks, but the techniques echo into the present. The idea that you can control a society by controlling its sense of what is real is not trapped in one decade. It is a recurring temptation of power. And so, as these chapters unfold, the question keeps widening. It started as, were they really being watched? It becomes, what does being watched do to a person? What does it do to a movement? Because surveillance is not only a violation of privacy, it is a shaping force. It changes behavior, language, risk tolerance, imagination. It teaches people to self-censor even in their own homes. It makes the future smaller. The revelation, when documents later surfaced, was not simply that the state had collected information. It was that the state had participated in storytelling, writing scripts for conflict, shaping reputations, nudging outcomes. And that leads us to a quieter, more personal question. If your life can be edited by someone else, how do you learn to recognize which parts of you are truly your own? It started with a joke and ended as a file. John Lennon arrived in America carrying more than a suitcase. He carried a reputation that could fill stadiums. He carried a voice that could turn a simple sentence into a chorus. And perhaps most dangerously, he carried the kind of cultural gravity that made politicians feel smaller than they wanted to be. For a while, his life in New York looked almost ordinary from the outside. A man in his early 30s walking city blocks, learning the cadence of a new country, settling into domestic routines with Yoko Ono. But ordinary is a fragile illusion when your name is already a symbol. Lennon wasn't a politician. He didn't hold office or write policy. He wrote songs, soft, sharp, tender, provocative. And in a time when the Vietnam War still haunted the national bloodstream, the idea that a global celebrity might align himself with anti-war activism looked, to some in power, like a threat that couldn't be ignored. The mechanics of attention are strange. A singer holds a concert and it's entertainment. A singer appears at a rally and it becomes a headline. A singer talks about peace, and suddenly, peace sounds like insubordination. Behind the scenes, the government's interest in Lennon grew into something more organized. Conversations were monitored, reports were compiled, his associations were mapped. The frame was not artist expressing views, but influential figure who might mobilize young voters. His celebrity became, in bureaucratic logic, a kind of weapon, one that needed to be neutralized. What does it feel like to live inside that logic? Imagine hearing that your immigration status is under scrutiny, not because of who you are as a person, but because of what you represent as an idea. Imagine being told, in polite legal language, that you might be removed from the country, while sensing that the real reason is not paperwork, but power. Lennon and Ono fought deportation attempts for years. Courtrooms replaced concert halls. Lawyers replaced bandmates. The struggle became a different kind of performance, one where the stakes were private, the right to stay, to build a home, to raise a child. And then, as records became more accessible over time, the suspicion that he was being watched gained weight. The government's interest wasn't abstract. It had been documented. It had been filed. It had been pursued with a seriousness that feels surreal when placed next to the human image of a man writing lyrics at a piano. There's a particular American tension here. The country that markets itself as a sanctuary for free expression also keeps archives on those who express too much. It celebrates rebellion as mythology while managing rebellion as risk. Lennon's story, in that sense, isn't only about him. It's about how easily cultural influence becomes political fear, how quickly a song can be treated as a strategy, how a musician can be recast as a threat simply because people listen. What makes this chapter resonate is its intimacy. Surveillance often conjures images of spies and secret meetings, of coded messages and distant enemies. But sometimes surveillance is aimed at a person buying groceries, pushing a stroller, making breakfast, writing a letter. It's aimed at the everyday, and the everyday is where identity lives. To be watched is to be subtly rewritten. You begin to anticipate how you will be interpreted. You begin to ask whether a friend is a friend or a question mark. You begin to edit your language before it leaves your mouth. Even your humor tightens. Even your silences feel recorded. Lennon continued to speak, though not always loudly. He remained himself, though the weight of being himself grew heavier. And then, as the decade turned, his life ended abruptly, not through policy or paperwork, but through violence so personal it still feels impossible to reconcile with the scale of his fame. The file did not cause that ending, but the file is part of the story of how power related to him, not as a human being with contradictions, but as a variable to manage. So we are left with a question that sounds simple until you sit with it. When a government watches an artist, is it protecting the public or admitting that art can change the world? In a quiet Chicago apartment, Fred Hampton spoke about breakfast. Not metaphorical breakfast, actual breakfast. Eggs, toast, milk. Food on a table for children who were trying to learn while hunger chewed at their attention. He described it the way a good organizer does, as something practical, measurable, impossible to argue with. A child who eats can think. A child who thinks can imagine a future. And yet, to the state, that kind of practicality can look like danger. Hampton was young, still in his early 20s, but he carried himself like someone who'd already seen how systems break people. He spoke with a warmth that made strangers feel like neighbors. He spoke with a precision that made opponents nervous. And he had a rare gift. He could build coalitions across lines that power prefers to keep rigid. He reached for unity where others reached for purity. He talked to gangs about discipline and community. He talked to working-class whites about shared struggle. He talked to black communities about self-determination that included not only defense, but care. In another timeline, he might have lived long enough to become a public official, a scholar, an elder. In this timeline, he became a target. The pressure around him came in layers. Meetings were watched. Movements were mapped. Informants appeared in rooms where strategy was discussed. People who later looked back would remember the strange feeling of being close to someone brilliant and sensing, at the same time, that invisible forces were tightening. Then came the night that still feels like a wound in the American story. December 4th, 1969. Before dawn. A raid. Police officers moving through a home where people were sleeping. Gunfire. Confusion. the abrupt transition from dreams to terror. Hampton was killed in his bed. What makes this story unbearable isn't only the violence. It's the surrounding questions, questions that refuse to die with him. Over the years, evidence emerged that an informant within the local Panther chapter had provided information that helped enable the raid. A floor plan, details, the kind of intelligence that turns a home into a battlefield. In the cold language of operations, it's assistance. In human terms, it's betrayal made actionable. And there's another layer, even harder to hold. The sense that the raid was not simply a spontaneous confrontation, but part of a broader pattern. An era in which aggressive policing and covert intelligence efforts intertwined, particularly around organizations seen as radical or destabilizing. The story becomes a portrait of a country capable of feeding children and fearing the people who feed them. Hampton's death didn't only remove a leader, it sent a message into the bloodstream of activism. You can be killed not only for what you do, but for what you might become. Potential itself becomes incriminating. For those who survived, the aftermath was a strange mixture of grief and calculation. They mourned a friend, a son, a partner. They also reviewed their own lives like evidence. They replayed conversations, searching for moments when trust had been misplaced. They wondered which parts of their world were organic and which parts had been arranged. It's one thing to lose a person to an obvious enemy. It's another to lose a person in a way that suggests the map of danger included hidden routes. And still, the moral complexity remains. People can argue about politics, tactics, ideology. They can debate the Panthers' choices and the state's responsibilities. But something deeper sits underneath those arguments. The question of whether a democracy can survive when it treats social healing as insurgency. Because Hampton's life wasn't only resistance, it was imagination. It was the belief that communities could care for themselves and for one another. And imagination is the one resource power cannot fully regulate unless it terrifies people into shrinking it. That is the lingering tragedy, the way violence doesn't just end a life. It narrows the future. So when we listen back now, through interviews, through transcripts, through the echo of his voice, we aren't only hearing a lost leader, we're hearing a fork in the road. And we have to ask, when a society kills a bridge builder, what does it do with the distance that remains? There is a particular ache in the idea that a poet needs a dossier. Jean Seberg was not a politician. She wasn't leading rallies or drafting manifestos. She was an actress, one of those faces that seemed to carry light. She became famous young, then became iconic in a new kind of cinema that felt like a breath. French New Wave, street corners, cigarette smoke, the camera moving as if it were alive. But in America, light can draw attention, and attention in certain eras can turn into scrutiny. Seberg cared about civil rights. She donated. She attended. She connected with people whose work mattered to her. In another country, or another decade, that might have been a footnote. In the late 1960s, it became a file. What happened next is one of the quietest forms of violence, reputation sabotage. At some point, a false story began circulating. An allegation about her personal life, her pregnancy, her relationships. It spread with the peculiar efficiency of a rumor that has been engineered. Suddenly, it wasn't about her acting or her activism. It was about shame, about scandal, about the kind of narrative that makes people stop listening to your ideas and start consuming your pain. For Seberg, the consequences were not theoretical. They were intimate and devastating. The world watched her private life become public property. She was harassed, mocked, cornered by cameras and headlines. The line between journalism and persecution blurred. Her mental health deteriorated under a pressure that few people around her could fully understand. Years later, as documents surfaced and stories were re-examined, the outline of something darker became visible. Evidence that government efforts included the dissemination of damaging information intended to discredit her. The aim wasn't to debate her beliefs. The aim was to make her a cautionary tale. This is how power sometimes handles dissent when it comes from unexpected places. It doesn't argue, it stains. And there is a gendered cruelty to this story that feels impossible to ignore. When women step into political or moral conviction, the response often targets their bodies, their sexuality, their respectability. It attacks the social fabric that holds a woman's public identity in place. It whispers that her value is conditional and that it can be revoked. Seberg's life became a tragic illustration of that dynamic. The scrutiny followed her across oceans. She tried to keep moving, to keep working, to keep living. But the pressure wasn't only external. It seeped inward, becoming a voice she couldn't turn off. The file wasn't just a folder in an office somewhere, it was a ghost in her mind. In 1979, she died in Paris. The public narrative at the time was already shaped by years of scandal and struggle. Only later did many people begin to understand how much of her suffering may have been intensified by deliberate attempts to ruin her. To speak carefully, documents do not erase the complexity of any one life. They do not claim that a file alone caused a person's end. Human lives are braided from countless factors: relationships, vulnerabilities, choices, chance. But the documents can confirm something that matters morally, that the harm was not entirely accidental, that a system participated in turning a person into a target. Seberg's story asks us to expand our definition of violence. Not every attack leaves bruises you can photograph. Some attacks are linguistic, narrative, social, psychological. They isolate a person by making them look unworthy of sympathy. And then there is the haunting part: how easy it is for the rest of us to participate without knowing. How quickly we consume a rumor. How casually we repeat a scandal. How effortlessly we become the chorus that helps power do its work. If this documentary were only about government files, it would be a history lesson. But it's also about us, about the human ecosystem in which those files matter. Surveillance is one thing. Character assassination requires an audience. So the question at the end of this chapter is quieter, but it lands with weight. When a lie is planted in public, how do we learn to recognize it before it becomes someone's reality? There are stories that arrive like thunder, and stories that arrive like fog. The fog stories are the ones that change your sense of direction without you noticing. The American Indian movement, known as AIM, formed in a time when native communities were carrying centuries of broken promises in their bodies. Poverty was not an accident. Displacement was not ancient history. It was ongoing. The wounds were living. AIM began with a demand that felt both simple and impossible: dignity. Not symbolic dignity. Dignity in housing, health, education, policing, and the right to exist without being treated as a problem. The movement drew attention because it named what many Americans had been trained not to see. And whenever a movement forces a country to look at something it has avoided, the country often looks back with suspicion. In the 1970s, AIM became a focal point of federal attention. Surveillance intensified. Informants were placed. Files grew thick. If you were an organizer, you began to feel the fog, the strange disruptions, the new tensions, the sense that someone was always listening. The hard part about this kind of attention is that it doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in patterns, in miscommunications that multiply, in friendships that suddenly fracture, in violence that appears at the edges and then moves inward. One of the most painful episodes tied to this era is the conflict at Pine Ridge Reservation and the atmosphere surrounding it, an environment where fear, division, and violence became common. People in the community spoke of intimidation and factionalism, of being caught between forces larger than themselves. In such climates, truth becomes fragile. Every story has shadows. Every accusation has echoes. Then came the shootout on June 26, 1975, in which 2 FBI agents were killed at Pine Ridge, and an AIM member, Joe Stuntz, was also killed. The case that followed would become one of the most controversial legal sagas in modern American history, the prosecution and conviction of Leonard Peltier. For decades, arguments about Peltier's case have been intense and polarized. Supporters have pointed to issues with evidence, witness testimony, and prosecutorial conduct. Critics have emphasized the deaths of the agents and the need for justice. The story has been fought not only in courtrooms, but in public memory through books, documentaries, petitions, and presidential appeals. Within that larger controversy sits the undeniable reality of federal surveillance and infiltration around AIM. Released records and investigations over time confirmed that the movement was closely monitored and that informants played roles in gathering intelligence. What remains deeply contested is how and to what extent those dynamics shaped the events that unfolded, and how much the legal process that followed was influenced by the climate of the time. This is where the documentary tone must slow down and breathe, because it's easy to turn complicated history into a simple moral shape. But the truth of communities under pressure is rarely simple. When people are living with poverty, trauma, and aggressive policing, violence can erupt from many directions at once. When informants and covert strategies are in the mix, the line between organic conflict and engineered chaos becomes harder to see. And yet, even without claiming certainty on every disputed detail, the emotional core of the story remains clear. Native voices demanding recognition were met with an apparatus that treated them as threats. The fog was not incidental. It was a feature. The deeper tragedy is how often indigenous struggles are forced to fight on two fronts. The obvious front, poverty, dispossession, discrimination, and the hidden front, surveillance, infiltration, narrative control. One front drains the body, the other drains the mind. In the decades since, AIM's legacy remains complicated, but its central insistence still rings that a nation cannot heal while refusing to acknowledge the people it has harmed. Files may eventually be opened. Court arguments may continue. But the daily reality of Native communities has never been a theoretical debate. So the question that closes this chapter is not only about one case or one movement. It's about historical responsibility. When a country watches a people more closely than it listens to them, what future can possibly grow from that imbalance? On a winter night, the city feels like an ocean made of glass. Streetlights shimmer, windows glow like distant stars, and somewhere behind a desk, someone turns a person's name into a category. The word subversive sounds dramatic when spoken aloud, but on paper, it is quiet. It fits neatly into a memo. It can be stamped, filed, and carried from one office to another without anyone raising their voice. That's what makes it dangerous. It can travel without emotion. In the decades after World War II, subversion became a kind of national obsession. Under the pressure of the Cold War, fear took on administrative form. Committees convened, loyalty oaths spread, careers were won and lost based on whispers and associations. For many Americans, the era is remembered through famous names: artists blacklisted, scientists questioned, teachers dismissed. But beyond the headlines, there were thousands of ordinary people who discovered, suddenly, that the country had been taking notes on their lives. A union organizer, a civil servant, a student, a writer, a church member who attended the wrong meeting, someone who signed the wrong petition, someone who was friends with someone who knew someone who was under suspicion. A file can start small: a single clipped article, a note about a speech, a record of attendance, a rumor treated as fact. And then, over time, the file becomes a parallel biography, one that the person never gets to edit. Imagine living with that invisible biography. It can shape what jobs you're offered. It can determine whether you're promoted, whether you're approved for a position, whether you're allowed to travel. But you don't know it exists. You just feel doors closing with no explanation. This chapter is about that slow, systemic erosion, the way surveillance doesn't always explode into scandal. Sometimes it simply changes the temperature of a life. In later years, as Americans used the Freedom of Information Act to request records, many received a strange gift and a strange curse: proof. Pages about themselves written by strangers, observations that were sometimes correct, often wrong, always unsettling. People saw how their words had been interpreted through paranoia, how their friendships had been categorized as associations, how ordinary political engagement had been recast as danger. There is a peculiar intimacy in reading your own file. It's like watching someone else describe your face. They recognize some features, miss others entirely, and still speak with certainty. And it raises a deeper question about identity. We think we are who we remember ourselves to be, our intentions, our loves, our private doubts. But files don't preserve intention. They preserve fragments, moments stripped of context, interpreted by someone with a mission. In that way, the file becomes an alternate self, a version of you optimized for suspicion. Sometimes that alternate self is enough to ruin a life. It might not show up as a dramatic arrest. It might show up as a rejection letter, a quiet firing, a friend who stops calling, a neighbor who becomes cold, a family member who looks at you differently because they heard something somewhere that made you sound dangerous. The Cold War era taught the nation a bitter lesson. Fear can be institutionalized. It can become normal. It can be defended as necessary long after the original danger has shifted or faded. And once fear has built an infrastructure, it rarely dismantles itself willingly. The story of surveillance is often told through famous targets, because famous targets are easier to narrate. But the larger truth is that systems of monitoring can touch anyone quietly, especially when the categories become broad enough. If the definition of threat expands to include dissent, criticism, or simply difference, then surveillance becomes less about protection and more about control. And control, when it becomes routine, changes the soul of a society. The fog returns here, too. Not the fog of a single raid or scandal, but the fog of a culture where people begin to self-censor because they sense they might be punished for the wrong thought. That is how free speech dies, not always through a ban, but through a whisper in the mind. Don't say that. Don't write that. Don't be seen with them. So the question that closes this chapter is one many people have asked after reading their own file. If a government can preserve a distorted version of you, how do you reclaim the right to define yourself? There's a moment when you first open a government file about yourself, where your stomach seems to forget how to hold itself. It isn't only fear, it's disbelief. You see your name typed in someone else's font. You see dates you recognize, days you remember as ordinary, now framed as suspicious. You see friends listed like assets. You see your choices reduced to a single line, stripped of tone, stripped of context, stripped of the small human reasons that made you do what you did. The paper doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. It simply sits there with a kind of institutional calm, as if to say, we were here the whole time. In this chapter, the focus shifts from the famous to the countless. The people who never made headlines, who weren't photographed on stage or quoted in history books, but who still felt the pressure of invisible attention. A teacher in a public school who attended a peace meeting at a church. A librarian who believed books should be available to everyone, including books that made people uncomfortable. A postal worker who joined a union drive. A student who traveled to a protest and came home with a sense that the world could be changed. Most of them never said, "I'm being watched," because saying it felt melodramatic or dangerous or futile. Instead, they said smaller things. My supervisor is acting strange. I didn't get the promotion, and I can't understand why. Someone called and asked questions about me. My phone line makes noises. People treat me differently now. Those statements don't sound like the opening of a documentary. They sound like life. But life is where systems do their quiet work. In the 1970s, investigations and public hearings began to reveal fragments of how extensive domestic intelligence operations had been. When the curtain lifted even slightly, it exposed methods that felt less like law enforcement and more like social engineering. Surveillance of political groups, monitoring of lawful dissent, infiltration, and various efforts to disrupt organizations considered troublesome. For many Americans, this was not just an abstract scandal. It was personal. It explained years of invisible pressure. It confirmed that the unease they had swallowed had not been invented. And yet the confirmation brought another kind of pain, the realization that the harm was not an accident. It was a process. What does that do to a person's relationship with their own country? Patriotism, at its healthiest, is love mixed with accountability. But when you realize you were treated as an internal threat for exercising rights you were taught to cherish, that love can sour into something like grief. Because grief is not only for people, it is also for ideals. Some people reacted by retreating. They stopped organizing, stopped writing, stopped attending meetings. Not because they stopped believing, but because they couldn't live under the weight of being observed. Their worlds shrank, and the shrinking looked, from the outside, like moving on. But inside, it was a kind of quiet surrender. Others reacted by becoming harder. If the state could watch them, they would watch back. They learned to speak in coded language, to use secure meeting spaces, to test loyalty, to keep their circles tight. This made movements more resilient in some ways, but it also made them more brittle. Secrecy can protect, but it can also isolate. It can turn community into a fortress. And then there were those who tried to do something even more difficult, to live openly anyway, to keep believing in the public square, to keep trusting that truth, spoken clearly, could still matter. Those people often paid the highest psychological cost, because openness in a surveilled world is not naivete, it is endurance. The emotional core of this chapter is simple. Surveillance doesn't only collect information, it alters the shape of a life. It changes how people love, how they talk, how they take risks, how they dream. It plants a second voice in the mind, a voice that asks constantly, how will this be interpreted? That voice is exhausting. It makes people less spontaneous, less joyful, less willing to be wrong in public. And since progress often requires people to be wrong in public, requires experiments, mistakes, awkward first attempts, surveillance can quietly slow the evolution of a society. Here is the strange part. Even when the files are revealed, even when the programs are exposed, even when officials admit wrongdoing, the psychological residue remains. A person can know rationally that the watching has ended and still feel watched. The mind learns patterns and is reluctant to forget them. So the question at the end of this chapter isn't only about what the government did, it's about what the experience does to a human being. When your private life is treated as evidence, how do you learn to feel innocent again? Imagine standing in a reading room with a stack of paper in front of you, each page a small mirror that doesn't quite reflect your face. This is the strange ritual of modern disclosure, the moment when secrecy becomes accessible but only in pieces. A government file is never a full confession. It is a curated glimpse. Names are missing. Lines are blacked out. Entire pages are withheld. The truth arrives like a coastline seen through fog, real but incomplete. And still, incomplete truth can change everything. By the time people began requesting and receiving their records through Freedom of Information laws, a new kind of citizen experience had emerged, the post-surveillance awakening. People who had lived with suspicion now held proof. People who had been dismissed as paranoid now held photocopies. Yet what they held was both validation and limitation. A file can confirm that you were watched. It can confirm you were discussed, categorized, monitored. But it rarely tells you the full why. It rarely explains the ripple effects, the conversations you'll never hear, the decisions made in meetings you were never invited to. It rarely shows you the full chain of cause and effect. It is proof, but it is also a reminder of how much remains unseen. This chapter is about that in-between space, the moment when a nation looks at itself through its own paperwork and realizes that paperwork can be a weapon. There is a temptation, once you have proof, to look for a single villain, to turn history into a morality play with a clear antagonist and a clear resolution. But systems don't work that way. They are made of people, yes, but also of incentives, fear, ambition, and institutional momentum. Someone writes a memo. Someone approves it. Someone files it. Someone follows an order because it feels normal in the culture of that office. Someone tells themselves it's for security or stability or the greater good. Years later, the paperwork becomes evidence, but the emotional logic that generated it is harder to prosecute. The people who did the watching may have believed they were protecting the country. The people who were watched may have believed they were saving it. Between those beliefs sits the fragile heart of a democracy, the question of whether dissent is a danger or a necessity. The revelations of domestic intelligence abuses in the 20th century forced Americans to confront a paradox. The same institutions tasked with protecting civil liberties can also violate them. The same government that promises freedom can fear freedom when freedom becomes inconvenient. It is easy to say, in hindsight, they should not have done that. It is harder to ask, why did so many people accept it at the time? Because acceptance is often built from ordinary emotions: fear of chaos, fear of change, fear of losing control. It is built from the seductive idea that safety requires someone else to be watched more closely than you. But history shows that surveillance rarely stays contained. When its tools exist, their use expands. The target list grows. The definition of threat stretches, and the line between security and control becomes a moving boundary. This chapter also holds a quieter revelation. That disclosure is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of another kind of struggle. People who receive their files often want more. They want the names behind the black bars. They want to know who reported on them. They want to understand which parts of their lives were affected. Sometimes they learn the identity of an informant, and it shatters old memories. A friend becomes a question. A moment of kindness becomes suspect. The past becomes unstable in a new way. Other times, they learn nothing more, and that lack becomes its own burden. Not knowing can be as corrosive as knowing, because it leaves the mind stuck in rehearsal, imagining possibilities, replaying scenes, trying to reconstruct what cannot be reconstructed. The most profound cost is how disclosure reshapes the meaning of memory. We tend to think of memory as private, personal, self-owned, but files remind us that memory can be institutional, that our lives can be recorded by strangers and stored in archives, ready to be revealed later like an echo. And that leads us into the final stretch of our journey, toward a question that feels both philosophical and urgent. If the state can hold a version of your life in a cabinet, who gets to decide which version becomes history? There is a difference between being watched and being understood. A camera can record your face, but it cannot record your intention. A microphone can capture your words, but it cannot capture what your silence meant. A report can list your friends, but it cannot explain why you loved them, or what you feared, or what you were willing to risk just to be decent. And yet, institutions often confuse observation with knowledge. They mistake data for truth. By the late 20th century, many of the most notorious domestic surveillance programs had been exposed, criticized, restructured, renamed. New rules were written. Oversight mechanisms were promised. The country, in a sense, tried to reassure itself. That chapter is over. But history rarely ends cleanly. It mutates. The deeper legacy is not only what happened, but what became normal afterward. The idea that monitoring can be justified by possibility, that suspicion can be preventive, that the future can be managed by collecting enough information in the present. This is the chapter where the story steps out of the archive and into the air we breathe now, because the world that followed these earlier campaigns didn't become less surveilled. It became more technologically capable of surveillance. The tools changed shape. The filing cabinets became servers. The microphones became metadata. The human informant became an algorithm that predicts behavior without knowing a person. And the emotional question remains the same. What happens to a human being when they sense they're being observed? Even people who have never requested a file, never been targeted for activism, never joined a movement, often feel a faint tension in modern life. A sense that conversations are not entirely private, that searches are remembered, that footsteps leave digital trails. The difference is that the watching is no longer only a matter of agents and officers. It's embedded in infrastructure. It's woven into convenience. The old stories we've followed in this documentary offer a warning that is not merely political. It's psychological. Surveillance reshapes behavior. It changes language. It encourages performance. It teaches people to become their own editors, trimming their thoughts until they fit what feels safe. But safety has a cost. A society where people constantly self-edit becomes a society where fewer bold ideas are spoken out loud, where fewer risks are taken in public, where fewer mistakes are made openly, meaning fewer experiments, fewer breakthroughs, fewer awkward beginnings that might become something valuable. In that sense, surveillance is not only about control, it's about imagination. It quietly discourages the kind of fearless curiosity that leads to discovery, art, and reform. And yet, if we tell this story only as a warning, it becomes heavy, even hopeless. The more human truth is more complicated. People resist in small ways. They keep loving. They keep building community. They keep speaking, even when it costs them. The figures in our earlier chapters did not have perfect knowledge. They had intuition, courage, and a stubborn insistence that the human spirit is not a file to be managed. They were flawed, like all of us, but their insistence mattered. That dignity is not granted by permission. It is practiced. So this chapter is an invitation to consider what freedom means when privacy is fragile. Not freedom as a slogan, but freedom as an internal experience. The ability to think without fear, to speak without constant calculation, to be wrong without being destroyed by it. Because the most intimate form of liberty is the feeling that your mind belongs to you. When people say, "I have nothing to hide," they often mean, "I have nothing to fear." But history suggests those are not the same. A file is not always built because you did something wrong. Sometimes it's built because you mattered to the wrong people. Sometimes it's built because you were inconvenient. Sometimes it's built because a system mistakes difference for danger. And so, standing at the edge of the archive, looking outward, we arrive at a question that connects the past to the present. If freedom requires the courage to be seen as you truly are, how do we protect the spaces where the self can still exist unrecorded? In the end, the file is not the story. The file is the shadow the story casts. Paper can record what a person said, where they traveled, who they met. It can outline a movement's structure. It can preserve the language of suspicion, but it cannot fully capture what made people step forward in the first place. The hunger for dignity, the ache for justice, the desire to be seen as human. That is the thread running through every chapter we've traveled. A civil rights leader sensing the walls listening. A fiery speaker surrounded by infiltration and doubt. A community program feeding children, while a system interprets care as threat. An artist fighting deportation because a song made people imagine peace. An actress punished not for violence, but for compassion. Indigenous organizers demanding recognition and finding themselves monitored instead of heard. Ordinary citizens discovering that their ordinary lives were quietly categorized. Different faces, different decades. A shared emotional pattern. The moment when a person realizes their life is being observed by an authority they cannot confront directly. At first, it sounds like paranoia. Then, it becomes a document. And then, if you're lucky, it becomes a public reckoning. Not always justice, not always accountability, but at least an admission that something happened. Something that should not be easy to repeat. Yet even that admission comes with a bitter lesson. Proof arrives late. Sometimes too late to save reputations. Too late to save careers. Too late to save the simple peace of believing you are unseen in your own private moments. So what do we do with this knowledge? One response is despair. To conclude that power always wins, that transparency is a myth, that democracy is only theater. But despair is a form of surrender, and surrender is exactly what these stories warn against. Another response is denial. To insist that such abuses are distant history, impossible now. But denial is the easiest path for repetition. When we forget the past, we make room for its return. The more difficult response is the one that requires maturity, to hold complexity without losing clarity, to accept that governments can protect and harm, sometimes at the same time, to accept that institutions are made of people, and people can be fearful, ambitious, convinced they are right, to accept that security is necessary, but that security without constraint becomes domination. And beyond the policy debates, there is the human question. What happens to a person's inner life when it is treated as evidence? When the most private parts of being human, relationships, doubts, mistakes, tenderness, are pulled into a system that sees them only as leverage? If you've ever felt misunderstood, you know a small version of that pain. The file is the large version. Misunderstanding with authority. Misinterpretation with consequences. In some of these stories, the targets kept going anyway. They continued to march, to speak, to organize, to create. That persistence wasn't only bravery, it was a refusal to let an external gaze define their internal worth. And that might be the most humanistic insight we can take from these histories. That dignity is not a thing you receive from institutions. It is a practice you maintain, even when institutions fail. But we also owe a quieter debt to those who couldn't maintain it, to those who broke under pressure, to those who retreated, to those who were destroyed by scandal, stress, or violence. Their suffering matters too. It is part of the cost. As we close, think again of that hallway in the federal building, the box behind the door, the files inside, each page a fragment of someone's life, each stamp a reminder that someone was watching. The question is not whether watching exists. It always has in some form. The question is who controls it, how it is limited, and whether a society can build enough moral restraint to keep curiosity from becoming cruelty. And finally, the question that sits like a candle in the dark, small, steady, and difficult to extinguish. If memory can be recorded, edited, and weaponized, how do we protect the part of human life that still belongs only to the human heart?